Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on this beautiful fall day in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History's Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Tomorrow, the Old Capitol Museum will have their annual Present Meets Past Living History program from 5 to 7 p.m. Figures that will be portrayed include the legendary bluesman Muddy Waters, former MDAH Director Charlotte Capers, and former Governor Hiram Runnels. And of course, you can see the museum's infamous dummy mummy throughout October as well, so I hope you'll join us for that. This Saturday will be the 3rd of the month, so admission to these museums will be free. Take advantage of that if you're not already a member and enjoying free admission. And then finally, at 6 p.m. on Thursday, October 24th, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum will have this month's Under the Light program, focusing this time on Black empowerment. Frank Figures of One Voice will discuss the 1966 March Against Fear, and Jackson State University's Mad Drama Troupe will perform a tribute to Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green. Those are always great, so please join us for that. And then finally, I hope that you'll join us next week for History's Lunch when Will Jacks will discuss his new book, Poor Monkeys, Portrait of a Juke Joint. Today, we are delighted to have William Sturkey, author of the book Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White. William Sturkey is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he teaches courses on African American history and the history of the American South. Sturkey earned his BA from Ohio State University, his MA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his PhD from Ohio State. He received the Mississippi Historical Society's Glover Moore Prize in 2008 for his master's thesis, Houses of Liberty, the Impact of Freedom Schools During SNCC's 1964 Freedom Summer, and then Sturkey's first book, To Write in the Light of Freedom, co-edited with John Hale, brought together the newspapers, essays, and poems produced by young black students of the Freedom Schools. Help me welcome William Sturkey.
Thank you. Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful, great, that's the easy part. All right, I just want to start off by saying thanks to Chris Goodwin for inviting me and helping to organize the talk. And thanks to all of you too, for your audience. I really do appreciate it. I know there are many other things you could do with your time. It's really an honor to be here. I came to the museums in August for the first time, and I was just so stunned by how beautiful they were, how impressive they are. It was my first time seeing them, and I really enjoyed it. And in particular, walking through the Civil Rights part, the Civil Rights Museum, felt like this is your life of my career, if you will. There's so many of those things I've seen in the archives that I learned in class, different things like that. And it means a lot to me to be here, and I really thank you for the opportunity. One quick thing about the talk before I jump right in is that I'm going to quote a fair bit from different sources, some of which kind of humorous, honestly. And so as opposed to saying that verbally, I'm going to signal with air quotes, okay, when I'm quoting from a different source, just so I don't jam up the flow of the talk, okay? So hopefully that's pretty clear. So behind me, you have a picture of the workforce at the J.J. Newman lumber plant taken in the early part of 1917. You see the white workers are in the front and the black workers are in the back. That's also the image that's the cover of the book, although the design team did a whole number on that, so it's hard to see, but that's the cover. On December 6, 1916, something happened at the J.J. Newman Lumber Company sawmill in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. December 6 was a Wednesday, a payday, and as always, the men received their paychecks at about noon during the lunch break. But on that particular Wednesday, when the 1 p.m. whistle blew, signaling them back to work, 100 of the black workers didn't return to their stations. In fact, they never returned to their stations. They had walked out of the mill after getting those paychecks and they had quit. Several of the white employees reported back that the black men had told them that they were going north. They were going to Chicago. These are not the only people to leave during this time. 6 weeks before, October 24th, 1916, over 150 black people from Hattiesburg leave town on a midnight train. They caught a train to New Orleans, and then they caught another train that took them up to Chicago. On December 11th, just 5 days after those men from the J.J. Newman Lumber Company quit, another 37 black residents left the city for Chicago. 2 days after that, another group left. And throughout that entire fall, hundreds of local African Americans left Hattiesburg specifically for Chicago. If there are any big blues fans in the audience, the name of one of the migrants might be familiar to you. Chicago blues legend Blind John Davis was just 2 years old when his mother and his father, who was a sawmill worker, picked up the family and left Hattiesburg for the Windy City in 1916. For some of these people, the migration seemed like a sort of biblical type exodus. Keep in mind, this is only 1916, and that emancipation had only occurred about 50 years earlier. Some of the people, presumably, were former slaves, and almost all of them were either the children or grandchildren of people who had been enslaved. And so for many of these people who leave, they still envision the North as sort of this holy land, right, where they could be free. A representative of the Urban League interviewed a lot of the migrants in Chicago, and he noted that Hattiesburg migrants firmly believed this migration is an act of God. The migrant told the labor agent that he was instrumental in God's hands. For some, crossing the Ohio River itself, that old demarcation between slavery and freedom, was a spiritual moment. When 147 Hattiesburg migrants crossed the Ohio River, they reportedly took out their watches and stopped them at 10:30, the exact moment they crossed. Then they bowed their head in silent prayer before breaking out into song. "I done come out of the land of Egypt, ain't that good news?" One woman went so far as to say that she could tell the difference in the air on the other side of the Ohio River. Meanwhile, back in Hattiesburg, these departures start to cause some problems for local white leaders who are relying on black labor. In an editorial titled "Negro in the South," the local paper said, "When they are gone from the South, their places will be hard to fill. They are the most docile people under the sun when they are working for white folks. No body of men can be found who will work as long and at as small wages and do it as uncomplainingly in forest and lumber camps in the mills of the South as the Negro does." Another newspaper article reported this: "Housekeepers are not taking at all kindly to the activities of the labor agents and are trembling lest they will soon have to build their own fire in the kitchen stoves on wintry days and cook breakfast." The most poignant example, of course, occurs at J.J. Newman Lumber. After the men quit, the mill struggles to complete the workday, and then it shuts down for 2 weeks as they look for replacements for those employees. So this is America's Great Migration story. Many of you have heard similar things about this, but despite the fact that these people come from the South, we often don't necessarily treat this Great Migration story as a Southern story, as a Jim Crow story, but it very much is. And one crucial factor in understanding the Great Migration, the broader complexities here, and what it can tell us about the South is this: a lot of the people that left were older than Hattiesburg itself. Any of those men who walked out of the mill on that particular day in December of 1916, if they were older than the age of 32, they were older than their employer. That means that they had not started there. They had started somewhere else, and they had come there as sort of a first leg in a longer journey that ultimately took them to Chicago. There was a migration before the Great Migration, is basically what I'm saying. These weren't people who worked in the same jobs as their parents. And so I want to talk about the meaning of that in a sort of a broader Southern New South context. And to fully understand the departure of those workers from J.J. Newman Lumber in 1916, we need to back up about 20 years, if you will. So I'll ask you to step back with me, if you're willing. I have the microphone, so please step back with me. To Hattiesburg about 20 years earlier, November of 1896. And if we can put ourselves in Hattiesburg in November of 1896, what we see is a 42-year-old Pennsylvania man stepping off a train. Okay, Hattiesburg, November of 1896. This man's name is Fenwick Peck. And he steps off the train and he gazes Hattiesburg for the first time. This is before the rise of the hub city of the New South. It's before the rise of J.J. Newman Lumber. And he sees Hattiesburg as a very young town. Okay, he was only 12 years old by the time he got there. And when Fenwick Peck, this Pennsylvanian, arrives in 1896, Hattiesburg looks more like a western frontier village than a rising city of the New South. It has no electricity, paved roads, telephones, and most of the buildings were shoddy one-story wooden structures. There's no police department. That means public vagrancies such as prostitution and street fights and gambling are fairly common sights. One contemporary observer called Hattiesburg a place full of wild women and wild horses. Just 3 years before Fenwick Peck arrived, the entire town almost burned down in a string of midnight fires. The worst of those fires occurred in October of 1893, and the blaze flew through the downtown, destroying 26 businesses and causing approximately $75,000 worth of damage. As the Daily Picayune told readers, for a time it looked like the whole town was gone. The worst victim of this fire was the local sawmill. In hindsight, this sort of cheap little sawmill was a virtual tinderbox. It had no sprinklers, it was filled with sawdust and all of that, had no alarms, no hoses or anything like that. And the October fire tore through the mill, destroying it, causing $30,000 worth of damage. The mill owners didn't have insurance, they were devastated. The town itself was devastated, it lost all the jobs that the mill had once provided. But the one opportunity that the fire did bring was that it attracted the attention of a Yankee lumberman named Judson Jones Newman, J.J. Newman for short. He was based out of Buffalo. He owned a sawmill in Pennsylvania. And he purchased that former site, and he planned a new modern sawmill in its place. That would become, of course, the J.J. Newman Lumber Sawmill. He recruited several investors, one of whom was Fenwick Peck, who came down to Hattiesburg in 1896 to look at the town. And about a year later, Peck essentially buys out J.J. Newman. So the name J.J. Newman actually refers to a company largely controlled by this man, Fenwick Peck. So here it's useful to draw our lens out a little bit to look at the region, not necessarily go backwards, but to think about what's happening in the South, particularly in that part of Mississippi. Hattiesburg has one great advantage by this point in time. In fact, it was the reason the town was founded where it was, and that it's located along this railroad line between New Orleans and Cincinnati called the Queen and Crescent City Route. This line was laid by a European syndicate between 1880 and 1894, and Hattiesburg famously is founded by William Harris Hardy right along the line as he's working for the railroad. So it's founded during the largest railroad boom in American history. Okay? In the year after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, 1870, in the 20 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, America's railroad mileage jumps from about 53,000 to about 164,000. That's good for an average of 15 miles of railroad track laid per day over 20 consecutive years, the largest railroad boom in American history. And of course, much of that track is laid throughout the South, opening up Dixie's interior for new settlements and new industries. Southerners, white Southerners in general, don't have a lot of resources in the wake of Reconstruction and the Civil War to lay those tracks, and so most of the tracks are laid by Northerners and Europeans. But white Southerners, who had rid themselves of Reconstruction by this point, they wanted those railroads. They wanted those railroads to modernize the region, to open the interior, and connect different merchants and farmers to the rest of American marketplaces. So they give tax breaks, they give land, they do what they can to attract the railroads. And of course, the railroads come. They accelerate the growth of existing towns, or they create entirely new cities altogether. Nashville, Atlanta, Chattanooga, Durham, Dallas, Birmingham, all these big cities with a bunch of towns in between them. These are the towns of the New South. These are the railroad boom towns. So in Mississippi, there's something else happening here too. In Mississippi, the railroads, many of them pass through one of the most thickly forested regions in North America, the Mississippi Piney Woods, which by the 1890s remained virtually untouched. So these railroads completely changed Mississippi's lumber industry by opening up that interior. Before railroads, in order to harvest the timber, you had to be near water, first of all. You'd have to cut down the trees, drag them through the forest using large oxen, and then somehow float them down rivers. This is, of course, extremely slow and dangerous. Railroads change all of that. They enable the harvesters to, there's a shorter distance to get to the railroads, and you can neatly stack, tie, and ship the timbers virtually anywhere in the world. And these timbers go all over, from Australia to Canada to South America to Asia. And so it's in this very context that this initial Hattiesburg sawmill burns down, and our man Fenwick Peck comes in 1896 and starts to look around and think about what he could do in this place at that particular time. So let's go back to Hattiesburg. So there are a number of different factors that spark Fenwick Peck's interest in Hattiesburg. One is the availability of the trees. The virgin forest lay pretty much untarnished, just as it had for hundreds of years. Fenwick Peck had been working in Pennsylvania, and he was starting to lose a lot of the trees and acreage up there. Peck was also attracted by the relative flatness of the land. He had worked in the Pocono Mountains, and obviously that's very challenging at times to harvest in mountain areas. And so he sees Mississippi and Hattiesburg and thinks, gosh, this is great, it's all flat. Another factor, of course, is the weather. There aren't any harsh winters or conditions that really impede lumber harvest in the way that they do in Pennsylvania. So in any case, Peck likes what he sees. He buys out J.J. Newman Lumber. He keeps the company name, but he greatly expands the size. Over the coming years, the company acquired more than 600 square acres of land. an area roughly twice the size of New York City's 5 boroughs combined. And by 1901, J.J. Newman Lumber was the largest sawmill in the state of Mississippi. It was producing approximately 75 million board feet of timber per year. At one point during its height, J.J. Newman Lumber produces enough board feet in 1 year to build a 3-foot tall fence around the entire coastline of the United States of America, including Alaska and Hawaii. It's an extraordinary amount of lumber. So Peck made a fortune. By 1922, his lumber holdings were valued at over $6 million, roughly $82 million today. And of course, for Hattiesburg, the company did wonders. Remember, this is sort of a backward settlement when he first got there. His investment, it sparks the city's growth into a modern city of the New South. The year that Fenwick Peck first came to visit Hattiesburg, Hattiesburg only had about 1,500 residents. 7 years later, his companies alone employ over 1,600 people, right? More people than lived there when he first got there. And this is what draws people to Hattiesburg. Thousands of people come to Hattiesburg to build new lives based on the promise of the wages paid at J.J. Newman Lumber. There are countless individual stories. Perhaps most famously, Paul Johnson, the first Paul Johnson who became governor of Mississippi, comes to Hattiesburg from Scott County, I believe it was, and takes a job at J.J. Newman Lumber, uses that money to help put himself through school, goes on to become a judge, and so on and so forth. But the real gist is this: social mobility. A lot of people who had been farmers, who had grown up unsure if they could meet their debts, take jobs that offer regular pay. Unlike on a sharecropping farm, when you put in the time and the work, you generally have a good sense that that is going to result in a net gain for your personal finances. So folks who had spent their entire lives in sort of these uncertain agricultural systems or these unfair agricultural systems, they can become sawmill managers, they can work their way up the line, they can make hourly wages and be sure that their jobs are going to be there every year, at least for a time. Hundreds of others came to take jobs at new firms that were related to the lumber industry, machine and repair shops and naval stores producers. Thousands more came to sell goods to the people who worked in the naval stores and the lumber industries. By 1913, it is estimated that the employees at J.J. Newman Lumber spend an estimated $30,000 per month in downtown stores. So if you are interested in selling groceries or shoes or anything like that, your life is also then connected back to the wages being paid out by the sawmills. So the mill becomes the backbone of the new town. This is the growth. And the town does whatever they can to keep it. In 1903, there is another fire. There's a fire at J.J. Newman Lumber. There's partial damage. The city offered a tax break and offered to help rebuild the mill. There was yet another fire again in 1908 at J.J. Newman Lumber, and the city offered a 10-year tax break for the mill to rebuild in order to make sure that it would stay in Hattiesburg and keep providing those benefits to the city of Hattiesburg. So J.J. Newman Lumber is the largest sawmill in Mississippi, but it's also just one of many sawmills in Mississippi, many of which were built by Northerners. By 1905, Yankee investors had poured over $24 million into Mississippi's lumber industry. People who are losing trees in places like Michigan and Minnesota and even Missouri come down to the South looking for new sources of pine trees, and they build these lumbers along the railroad tracks. There were 3 main railroads that run through Hattiesburg. By the early 20th century, there were over 120 sawmills working on those 3 main railroad tracks. It's part of the most extensive lumber boom in American history. A lot of people don't think about the South when they think about lumber. They think about Washington or Oregon or something like that. But 4 of the 5 most heavily lumber-producing states at the turn of the 20th century were southern states. In 1880, Mississippi's lumber industry employed about 1,100 people and produced less than $2 million worth of lumber products. In 1910, 30 years later, the industry employed roughly 40,000 people and produced over $42 million worth of goods. 1,100 and less than 2 million, and 30 years later, over 40,000 and more than $42 million worth of goods. That year, Mississippi produced the 3rd most amount of lumber of any state in the United States of America. It was a massive industry, and Hattiesburg sat right in the center of it. So, the people come. Between 1890 and 1910, roughly 20,000 people moved to Hattiesburg or the surrounding area. This is a place that was virtually unsettled as late as 1880. And of course, this is how the city rises, from that rugged outpost that Fenwick Peck first saw to this new modern city of the South, of this new South. People came from all over to take advantage of these new opportunities. Most of the migrants who moved to Hattiesburg were white, roughly about 2/3. Sort of an easy cheat sheet. The Hattiesburg population is always about 2/3 white. And they come from different places in Mississippi or from neighboring states such as Tennessee, Alabama, or Louisiana. Smaller numbers come from really all over the South. People come from southern states such as North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Florida, Georgia. Most interestingly, perhaps, some of the white migrants actually come from the north. The black folks tend not to do that, don't go north to south at this point in time. But a lot of white migrants, or significant numbers, come from the north. I've got census records that indicate people from Vermont, from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, a few folks from Canada, and even one man from Norway in the early 20th century living in Hattiesburg, mostly working in jobs connected to that lumber industry. So most white Mississippians, to be sure, in the state remain in agriculture, but those who come get the benefits of wage labor. It's this new level of stability and security unavailable to many previous generations. And so, of course, it's important to realize that many of these people came from very impoverished backgrounds. They're largely the generation that grew up in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and they're just looking for something better. And as they come to Hattiesburg, they organize in their churches and their businesses and their organizations to craft a new society. And of course, part of their order for this new society, part of their request for this new society is a resurrection of definitive racial boundaries. So there's this sort of new settling happening. Of course, race has had a long history in the state, but as the New South is rising, they're looking for new racial boundaries. And the modernization of places like Hattiesburg, highlighted by the railroads, gives them a chance to accomplish this. There's the most basic, residential segregation. You all have heard of the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. Well, the railroad tracks often demarked when the black and the white neighborhoods were separated. But then also segregation laws were actually pioneered on the railroad cars. Mississippi's first Jim Crow law, what we largely consider to be Mississippi's first Jim Crow law, was a railroad segregation ordinance passed in 1888. And it called for separate cars for black and white passengers. And one of the interesting things about this first law is that it was challenged in court. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. But it's not challenged by an African American, actually. It's challenged by a company. It's challenged by the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas Railroad Company, who files a lawsuit. And they say, well, if it's okay for the state to have different seating arrangements based on race, what are we going to do if Louisiana has a separate seating arrangement, or if Tennessee has a third, or if Alabama has a fourth? How could we possibly ask our railroad conductors to stop at every single state border and reorganize based on whatever the state called for in terms of racial segregation? So they lost the case. As it turns out, really the white folks who passed the law were more interested in elevating white citizens over black citizens, and it never got quite that complicated. But this, of course, established this precedent for racially inferior segregation to spread to every aspect, to every other way of life. With this law upheld in 1890, other southern states passed similar legislation, including Louisiana later that summer, which passed the law that was famously challenged by Homer Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson. The jobs of this New South were also segregated. White people took the best jobs and consolidated the finest opportunities of this system, of this New South system. And of course, a major component of that racial order that would come to be known as Jim Crow is violence, especially lynching. In Hattiesburg, the new white migrants who arrive in town to take these new jobs also engage in severe acts of violence. In 1890, 30 to 40 white citizens took a black man accused of rape and hung him from a tree. In 1895, a 1,000-person mob led a black man through the streets, tied his arms up between two trees, and fired somewhere between 500 and 700 bullets into his body. 1899, Henry Nobles in Hattiesburg was shot dead by an angry crowd after being accused of sexual assault. In 1903, 500 white people dragged Amos Jones from his jail cell a half-mile through town, strung his body up, and then fired shots into it. So, of course, this violence is a means to protect and enforce white supremacy. This is the New South. This is the story that many of you, of course, are familiar with. And, of course, you understand what comes next over the ensuing decades. But the other thing about the South is this. The region, of course, is filled with black people because of the legacies of agricultural slavery and wanting to increase the number of enslaved people in places like Mississippi. Mississippi itself was predominantly black. In 1900, Mississippi had the highest percentage of black residents of any state in America, 58%. And the region simply couldn't modernize in the way it wanted to in some parts of the region without using at least some parts of this population. They were really important to this process as well. And of course, the white industrialists from the North really wanted access to cheap black labor, quite frankly. And so African Americans were also among the migrants to these New South cities. In Hattiesburg, again, they were about 1/3 of the population. And they also take the jobs of modernization, many of them also seeking a way off the farm, break the cycle of sharecropping. And these are generally the worst jobs, but they're a big part of this story. It is rare to see African Americans, let's say, in jobs such as manager or foreman or conductor or engineer, but black workers dominate other particular types of work in this New South. Take the railroads, for example. In 1910, Mississippi black workers comprised 60% of brakemen, 60% of firemen, 87% of general laborers on railroads, and 97% of railroad porters, the men who would carry the bags and such to the railroad cars. The same can be said of the lumber industry. The lumber industry loved to hire African American workers. In fact, many sawmills preferred black workers. As one Southern sawmill manager explained, "I would rather have one black man in a sawmill than 2 white men. All he wants is 3 square meals a day and his wage paid to him every Saturday night." In Mississippi, African Americans were 70% of the sawmill workers. So this massive industry is very, very black. And the actual logo of J.J. Newman Lumber itself featured a African-American woman who was shaped into sort of a living tree. It's a very problematic logo, but nonetheless, the logo was black. African-Americans were also 94% of turpentine workers in the state of Mississippi. To share with you a little bit of personal history, my great-grandfather, we don't think of people moving from north to south, but my great-grandfather, who lived in North Carolina, moved to southern Alabama during this exact same time to take a job as a naval stores worker. 94% of naval stores workers were African American. So these are the most dangerous and menial jobs, but the sawmill boom came, and it changed the nature of work for tens of thousands of African Americans. So modernization and the growth of urban centers in the New South also has a similar impact for a lot of black female laborers. They are excluded from many of the opportunities of the New South, even more so than African American men. But if you think about it, there are some jobs that black women are able to take because of the rise of cities. So if you're working as a domestic, so black women are usually restricted to work as domestics or teachers, but if you're working as a domestic in a city, then you can have sort of more of a choice about where you actually work. There are more customers sort of clustered together in larger cities. You can also have more of a choice about your exact occupation. If you don't want to clean people's houses, then you could perhaps become a laundress. In 1880, Mississippi only had 5 towns with over 2,500 people. At that time, there were only 3,000 black laundresses. In 1910, when Mississippi had 29 towns, over 2,500 people, there were more than 18,000 laundresses. So, of course, being a laundress is a very old profession. Black women had always worked in laundry, but not that many people could only work in laundry in rural areas. Urban areas cluster these customers together and give more access to those sorts of jobs. Tens of thousands of other black women, of course, work in various urban domestic labor positions. And there are plenty of problems with these jobs, the black men, the black women, all of them. And I'd be happy to elaborate. There are unequal pay, dangerous working conditions, violence, open to sexual assault, these sorts of things. But they do 2 other things as well, from the black perspective, if you will. One, they provide flexibility and mobility. In cities and small towns, you can quit and change employers, find a new job if you need to. 2, they also, again, offer this way off the farm, just like they did for many of the white citizens who took the lumber jobs. So again, like most white Mississippians, most black Mississippians remain in agriculture across the state, but those who come to Hattiesburg gain access to unprecedented mobility made possible through wage labor. Many become the first people in their family to work outside of agriculture. And so in Hattiesburg, this quintessential city of the New South, this is what emerges: industrial jobs and wage labor, separately developing communities that are literally at times separated by the railroad tracks, This white supremacy that's backed in violence and this control over African Americans is part of this Jim Crow racial order of this new modern South. But then something else happens that really throws a little wrench into our story, and that's that the black people start leaving, just as they did J.J. Newman lumber in 1916. Between the fall of 1916 and the spring of 1918, as World War I was occurring and northern factories needed more labor than ever, just at the time that immigration across the Atlantic slows down, an estimated 2,500 black Hattiesburgers left the city. More than half of the city's black population got up and left in the course of less than 2 years. And as I mentioned, many local white leaders and employers had a big problem with this. When the men left J.J. Newman lumber, the mill closed for 2 weeks. Other firms also lost black employers and experienced labor shortages. And so at first, what the local white leaders try to do is they try to reassure themselves. So you see this in the newspaper, different papers and letters in the Chamber of Commerce records. One newspaper article claimed that the numbers were fraudulent and that they have been exaggerated. Okay. Another newspaper article tried to reassure readers. It said that when the war is over, they undoubtedly will return to their old work and seek their own jobs. They will get back to Dixie any way possible and will fill the towns and communities which they are deserting. Another article said this: the Negroes thought they wanted to go to Chicago and accept big paying positions in the packing houses there. This thought was in the uppermost in their minds until the lights of Hattiesburg began fading in the distance as their train chugged on toward the north. Then those homesickness blues attacked about half of them. A special railroad man had to stay in each car, it was stated today, to prevent some of the Negroes from jumping through the windows. So the newspaper is saying that these people, as the town starts to get more distant, they're so desperate to get back that they start jumping through the windows. At one other point, a local newspaper brings in an expert, okay? And he claims that African Americans can't survive in northern climates. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. They will take colds and develop pneumonia and consumption as well as other diseases. They will either die there or be brought home in a dying condition, this expert reports. It's not exactly true. But of course, none of this is really doing all that much for them. And so the local white leaders, even as they try to reassure themselves about the departures, they also take steps to try and stop them. The Chamber of Commerce advised employers to get out in front of the situation and either raise pay or alert officials to prevent labor losses. They're very worried about these northern labor agents coming down, some of whom are just, a figment of their imagination. Others are more real, but there aren't dozens of them in every city. In any place, city police try to stop these labor agents from coming. In 1917, county officials report that they have identified 3 individuals that they plan to run out of town for recruiting African American people north. Police officers break up black crowds waiting at the railroad depot. They're suspicious of black people at the railroads, and they break up the crowds. What are you doing here? The Urban League reported that police held Negroes away from the ticket office and arrested them for getting on trains without a ticket. 2 of the black men who get on a train and have some sort of mistake and step off are fined $2.50 each. A few local sawmills raise wages for black workers, but ultimately they can't stop this exodus. They don't stop this exodus. At one point, a white sawmill owner runs down to the railroad station and pleads with former employees not to go. A report says, just before another party left, old man Tatum ran down to the station and begged the men not to leave his place, offering more money. The Negroes refused. That's what it has come down to. A local white sawmill owner running down, ordering them, begging them not to go. But there's nothing that he can really do. Even in the midst of Jim Crow, what we think of often as sort of the nadir of black life, that sawmill owner had lost an element of his power. They were leaving, and there was just simply nothing that he could do. The greatest irony, of course, if you think about this more broadly and what it means if we look back 20 years, is that it was the white Mississippi leaders who had essentially laid the groundwork for these departures. It was they who gave land to the railroads. It was they who welcomed the railroads and the sawmills and northern investors with free land and tax breaks so that the mills would stay and they helped rebuild the mills, of course, when they burned down. It's the very modernization that they welcomed, the steel, the lumber that their new society depended on that allows those black workers to find an exodus from the Jim Crow South. And one of the more interesting things about Chicago is how the Hattiesburg migrants actually settled together. They formed a cluster in Chicago's South Side, almost like their own ethnic community. We think of ethnic communities during the era of immigration, early 20th century, Polish communities, Italian communities, etc. There was a little community of Hattiesburgers who lived together within a larger black neighborhood in Chicago. A representative from the Urban League reported, "There is in Chicago a little colony of Mississippians from Hattiesburg, which has been transplanted so completely as to retain practically all of its customs and social mores. There is in Chicago, there's a Hattiesburg Social Club, there's a Hattiesburg Social Service Club, there is a Hattiesburg Barber Shop, there is also a deli, a pool hall, and a coal and wood company, all owned by Hattiesburg migrants." An Urban League official reports, "At the barber shop, it is possible to meet all old friends from home or learn about their whereabouts." When one of the Hattiesburg migrants was asked why they lived together in Chicago, she explained, "I guess it's because they made us stick together down there." Chicago, of course, is very far from perfect, but it offered these people something different than Mississippi. As one Hattiesburg migrant explained, "They say that we are fools to leave the warm country and how our people are dying in the East. Well, I, for one, am glad to have the privilege of dying a natural death. That is much better than the rope and torch. I will take my chances with the northern winter." But again, almost none of them came from Hattiesburg originally. Hattiesburg for these people was a way to get off the farm, to get into the city, and then ultimately a road toward a more promising life outside of the Jim Crow South altogether. So I'm going to wind down here. So all of this is a major part of my book. Chapter 4 details much of this migration, this exodus, what this means, and also why it starts to happen in the way that it does, why these people live together, what they had built before they go to Chicago in Hattiesburg, and how that's carried over the years. There's a Hattiesburg social club in Chicago at least as late as 1966. So there's always this constant connection between the two places, among the black community at least. But most of the rest of the book is about those who actually stayed in Hattiesburg and lived under Jim Crow. And the Great Migration affected those people as well, for a number of different reasons. One, everybody that came up after that had a choice. Do I stay or do I go? So that's one of the big things. But then there are more concrete examples as well. One is that local white leaders trying to stave off the migration begin to open more of a dialogue with local black leaders about ways they can improve black life in order to alleviate some of these departures. Of course, they're only willing to go so far, but there's a conversation happening. A lot of the sawmills do actually raise wages. Not a whole lot, but they do actually raise wages. And one of the things that happens in Hattiesburg is that even though the city was largely depopulated of its black population, it's repopulated again almost like that. A whole other wave of people come in from different parts of the South to take those jobs at J.J. Newman Lumber. The people you see behind me are some of the people who came in after the beginning of that exodus and now worked at J.J. Newman Lumber early on in 1917. 3, and this is, I think, the most important. The city built a black high school. The city did not have a black high school before the Great Migration. So in response largely to all these people leaving, these people want education, they want safety, they want better living conditions. The city builds a black high school. And this high school becomes perhaps the most important black institution in town over the next 30 years or so. So my book, Hattiesburg, moves through this journey. It proceeds chronologically throughout Jim Crow, through its rise and how it changes, and ultimately until how it falls. And the thing that I've talked about today obviously focuses on the black community predominantly, but this story is not just about one community or the other. The history of Jim Crow is very much about white people as much as it is about African Americans. It's not just these two completely different communities experiencing things in different ways. There are major differences, yes, but those communities existing in the same city share a form of common destiny. And so the book itself is actually segregated. What it does is it flips back and forth between representative perspectives from the local white community and then the local black communities as they concurrently move through this era of Jim Crow. It shows how these white leaders try to plug into American modernization while also establishing and maintaining control over African Americans. And then at the same time, as I've been describing, it shows how these structural changes alter Jim Crow and present new opportunities for some of the African Americans, like some of the people who left. Now, of course, one of the dangers of this is that racial oppression, severe racial oppression, exists throughout this story. Certainly local whites are often very successful in maintaining the most visible aspects of Jim Crow, which become the targets of the civil rights movement, of course. But I think across time, this sort of intimate, interracial view exposes more subtle alterations to Jim Crow. And there are a few different examples of this. So Old Man Tatum, that sawmill owner who begged the black workers not to leave, he's one of my primary characters in the white community. And he is a white supremacist, no question about that. And I can prove that up and down the 20th century. But if we also look at his perspective balanced against what's happening with black people, we see how his control diminishes over time. There's this moment when these people leave. When the Great Depression comes, his own public segregation laws are challenged by the Red Cross in the 1930s, which refuses to segregate. We see how he and his colleagues are forced to try and limit lynching in the town in order to attract new investors when the sawmills cut out. And then we see how new opportunities for African Americans are inadvertently created by the New Deal and World War II, the rise of Camp Shelby, things that he welcomes, but then also have these inadvertent consequences for African Americans. And we see through the long lens of how some of these black sawmill workers that he employed, even though they are discriminated against, that they're able to somehow provide better lives for their children, who then lay the roots of black community organizing that eventually becomes the civil rights movement in Hattiesburg. And so in a narrative history of Jim Crow in a place, this book illuminates how these concurrent processes affected the framework of race in the modern American South. It's not just about it's about Hattiesburg, but it's not just about Hattiesburg. I wanted to use Hattiesburg as a lens, or even a character, if you will, to take us through this journey of American modernization and tell this much larger history of Jim Crow in the modern American South, both how it started, how it changed, and then ultimately how it became undone. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions. I think there's a microphone going around if you have them. Thank you so much.
What was the main lumber you used for or main type of tree that was harvested?
Longleaf yellow pine, predominantly. And one of the things I didn't mention, but that will probably make complete sense, at the time that the Mississippi lumber industry starts booming, electricity is spreading to American cities, right? This is the beginning of the Great White Way, 1880s, 1890s. We're getting telephones, we're getting electricity. Longleaf yellow pine to this day is the most widely used lumber for utility poles. So people in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia want longleaf yellow pine for other purposes, but utility poles is one of the big ones.
Did African Americans continue to use the Hattiesburg mills as kind of a stopping place before moving on to the north in the years following that Great Migration?
So the mills don't last a whole lot longer. So not really, not to that extent. J.J. Newman Lumber cuts out in 1925, I believe. And the Great Depression comes to all parts of the country, obviously, but it comes a little bit early to Mississippi. J.J. Newman lays off its third shift, and then it slowly starts to cut out. And the lumber industry basically, it almost ceases to exist in Mississippi for a period of time. But the scale of it diminishes quite a bit. And by 1932, it's pretty much dead as an industry in terms of what it meant before. So that opportunity then changes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm just kind of curious. I graduated from the University of Southern Mississippi. I lived in Hattiesburg for a long time. I'm just kind of curious what made you interested in the city itself.
Sure. So I was interested in, it's hard to know how deep of a dive to do with that question, but so I grew up in Pennsylvania where I wrestled with race a great deal in growing up, and I thought I was going to major in business, and then I got to a history class in college, and I was like, oh my God, this explains the architecture and why all these things existed in my life. And I was really drawn to the civil rights movement. I was drawn to the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and I just thought that the freedom schools were incredible. I was so inspired learning about young people who were saying, this is what my life is going to be like now. I'm joining the civil rights movement. I was interested in Hattiesburg because Hattiesburg had the largest freedom school system during the 1964 Freedom Summer. And the first day of freedom school in Hattiesburg is amazing. Over 600 kids show up. They're clapping, they're writing newspapers, they're singing, they're just bouncing off the walls. They close registration and the students start sneaking their friends in. It's this amazing moment in these black churches, July 2, 1964. And I was interested in, I was thinking about writing about freedom schools, and I sat down to think, okay, that's great. I'll start with asking myself, where do these freedom schools come from? Where does that energy come from? Where do those churches come from? And then answering that question ultimately became this project of explaining this sort of deeper history of how race changed in ways that led up to the civil rights movement. So I think in the book, by the time you get to the freedom schools now, the book now ends with the freedom schools, you know what these black churches have been doing for 80 years. And so it's sort of like, oh, of course they're going to meet at, St. Paul. They had these political meetings at St. Paul 70 years before. So that's how I got to Hattiesburg.
Yeah. James Reed, I'm originally from Hattiesburg.
Yeah.
And in reading your book, it was interesting to find that you mentioned my great aunt and great uncle dealing with Eureka High School, the black school that they established there for the black student. I graduated from Eureka in junior high school. I also am a graduate of USM in 1976. My high school classmate, Relana Adams, was integrated USM along with the young lady came, Elaine Armstrong. She was my church member as well as high school. As I said, St. Paul was my church in Hattiesburg. But the gentleman asked the question, how did you become interested in Hattiesburg? But you explained that. I left Hattiesburg in 1962 to join the military. And oddly enough, I left because I worked for the railroad, Illinois Central. My dad had worked for the GS&I, Gulf Shipping Outlet. Those were one of the three railroads that ran through Mississippi at that time. Your book is very inspiring, I have to say that. And this is really not a question, just a comment. I appreciate the book, and I appreciate the fact that I had a chance to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and I appreciate you undergirding my point about railroads and migration and mobility through your own shared experience.
One other point. In 1967, I became the first African-American to be promoted to engineer in Mississippi. Oh, thank you. I thought I project well. And in 1967, along with Eddie Smith, we became the first African-Americans to be promoted to engineers with the Illinois Central Railroad.
Great, nice.
Well, were you able to detect any effects on Hattiesburg of either black or white participation in the First and Second World Wars?
Yeah, quite a bit. As opposed to necessarily measuring who went and fought, my book traces the effects of the wars on Hattiesburg itself. And World War II, because it was so short and not quite as big, had a smaller effect. I do a little bit less with that. Certainly that's related to the migration. But World War II is massive. And I said there are segregated chapters. Two of the chapters, one white, one black, are basically devoted to the effects of World War II. On Hattiesburg, especially the presence of all the soldiers who trained at Camp Shelby, the black and white soldiers who then flooded the downtown and basically saved the town from the Great Depression.
Could you talk about the differences in resources and source material for the two stories that you tell in the separate chapters?
Yeah. This is really an inside baseball question, and thank you for that. But it's, I'll tell you, the thing that I say, and I really believe this is true, writing about white Hattiesburgers during the era of Jim Crow and writing about black Hattiesburgers during the era of Jim Crow are two different genres entirely. So Hattiesburg has a great archive, they have a really wonderful collection, and they have good stuff going for white people going back, late 19th century. So you can find diaries and letters and poems and stories and all that sort of stuff going back to the 1920s, 1910s. Because of Jim Crow itself, that made my job harder for researching black people because the archivists weren't collecting the materials from the black community in the same way. The other issue is that African Americans lived in a floodplain. So even if a letter or a picture somehow survived 60 years of Jim Crow, there was a flood in the 70s that might have got that thing, or any other time. So that was very challenging, the differences. The white community is a little bit easier to follow. I've got the newspaper. The newspaper is also segregated. That's a function of Jim Crow. So, the white community is built a little bit easier to build that narrative. The black community was more challenging. One thing that I do have now that other people didn't have in the past is I have digital access to census data through Ancestry.com, which is amazing. And I also have access to city directories, which were good. This is kind of messed up, but in researching Mississippi during the era of Jim Crow, it was so segregated that you can always tell in the city directory who was black and who was white, because there was a little C next to the black people's names. And if you're trying to recount all of that, it makes it easier because they have these are the black stores, these are the white stores. They weren't listed together. So if you're tracking that across time, that helps. But I had these digital newspapers that were searchable. I didn't have the Hattiesburg American that was searchable, but I had the Chicago Defender. And the black people in that neighborhood left me clues. So they would often, because they weren't, updates from their local news were not printed in the Hattiesburg American, they sent updates to the national edition of the Chicago Defender. And then those would be printed. So I had over 400 articles about Black Hattiesburg printed in the Chicago Defender that allowed me to really recapture what much of black life was like there.
Looking at the two communities, I noticed you mentioned a white individual. Was there anyone who stood out in the black community in your studies dealing with Jim Crow?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's a little bit harder to track individual stories, but there's a lot of different stories that come throughout. But I build the black community largely through this family named Smith. And so it's this guy named Turner Smith, who is a former teacher. He had been enslaved as a young person. He'd gone through the Freedmen's Bureau schools, and he's a person that loses a lot when Reconstruction ends and the white redeemers take back over the state. He loses his position, he loses his opportunity to make a living, and he comes to Hattiesburg with his young family in 1900. And so I build the black community through the lens of them. And there's only so much I can do with that because the records are a bit sparse. But then I develop the black community sort of around them, and I tell the story around the different organizations that they played a role in, such as the local Negro Business League. They were members of St. Paul Methodist Church. His sons' names are etched on the cornerstone to this day. And so there's a lot of different stories, but they're largely told through the lens of the neighbors of the Smith family and the people that they interacted with, the people they went to church with, the people that they bought groceries from, that sort of a thing. So there's a lot of smaller stories, but again, they're a bit harder to track than many of the people in the white community.
You have inward migration and outward migration. What I mean is that you have a lot of workers migrating out, leaving the lumber industry because of the terror of the Klan and the lynching and Jim Crow laws and so on. Blacks are leaving. Great migration, and you got other people coming in and taking the jobs that the black people leave. In addition to that, you have a few white people who are making a lot of money and a lot of black people who are making very little. What kind of economic impact does this have on the economy of Mississippi?
So Mississippi's got a few different stories. If I can, I'd like to answer your question through the Hattiesburg lens, if that's okay. But so yeah, we can measure median income and things like that through every census. It's pretty easy to look up now how much real estate somebody owned, how many personal items they own, something like that. So it's pretty easy to measure the wealth, and I do that throughout every chapter. And the black wealth, of course, is always less than the white wealth in Hattiesburg. But then if you compare Hattiesburg to the rest of the state, the black people in Hattiesburg are doing far, far better, certainly, than any of the black people, any of the black counties in the Delta. And Hattiesburg is usually top 3 for personal income for African Americans. Part of that's certainly related to the sawmills and the railroad jobs, but the other part is related to this black downtown that grows, this Mobile Street district that grows in Hattiesburg. And so a lot of the people that do really well are the people that own businesses in this particular neighborhood. And that's a pretty thriving, vibrant community. They have doctor's offices, pharmacies, drugstores, joints, things like that. The people that do the best generally come from that neighborhood. And so with the income, there's a big income gap. But there's also a pretty significant income gap between the black community in Hattiesburg and many black communities elsewhere in the state. Same can be said for different things like education, access to health care, a lot of different metrics.
Enjoyed reading your book, glancing through it. Interesting, last night, I was reading Zora Neale Hurston, Mules and Men,
Yeah.
and I noticed that, I know in Florida, but she got a lot of tales from turpentine camps.
Yeah.
Was she cited in here, in your book?
Oh boy, I don't think I did cite Zora
Well,
Neale
I've been looking, but I know she did go through turpentine camps and got a lot of stories from the turpentine workers.
Yeah, it was important to me. I mean, it's obvious in the records. The people in naval stores are all over the place, and the population is significant in that area. And like I said, it was only about halfway through the book that I discovered that my own ancestor had been one of these people who also was a turpentine worker, not in Hattiesburg, but just a state over in southern Alabama as well. And then, of course, in the oral histories, a lot of people talk about their fathers. In blues songs, people talk about turpentine naval stores.
This may be a very hard question to answer, but I thought you made a really great point at the beginning, which is that whereas the Great Migration is such a central part of Northern history, a place like Chicago and Detroit, it really hasn't been factored into our understanding of Southern history. And you do a great job in your talk of laying that out. So how would Southern history and the narratives of Southern history change when we incorporate the fact that such a significant percentage of the population left and created these sort of diaspora communities?
Yeah, I think the one thing to me is that I've throughout my intellectual journey, if you will, if you look at modernization through the lens of the South, it's so incredibly bleak for African Americans. It's the oncoming of segregation. It's more lynching. It's all these horribly things that are very much true. But I always had a problem with people writing about things that were happening to African Americans as opposed to things that African Americans were doing, right? And this population was never passive, just sitting back, taking all of this, absorbing it. So I think that view of modernization is actually quite a bit more complex than we've portrayed it in the past, certainly at least until the last decade or so. Black people are making decisions. They're not just sitting around waiting to get beat up or whatever. They're making decisions based on their understandings of their past and their perceived notions of their future and what they think they can provide for their children. And so, there are a lot of victims, absolutely, but it's a bit more complex than that. These people who are moving in these cycles, coming to places like Hattiesburg, then moving to places like Chicago, are able to achieve some pretty dynamic things in terms of how they're able to break up a long lineage of like life in the fields, for example. And so it's not always this downward trajectory. It's not necessarily just this nadir for everybody. There's an upwardly mobile population in this. And I think that's important to understand about Southern history.
Did your research tell you what precipitated this actual event at the Newman Lumber Company? Was there a labor agent from the north that promised all these people jobs if they would get on the train and move north?
Yeah, the sources are a bit dubious with the labor agents. I mean, they make all these claims that, after they start talking about black people can't survive snow, you're kind of wondering, how accurate are all these things? But, it was not the first group to leave. Hattiesburg was a site that people definitely recruited from, so there were some labor agents there. But it's this sort of community-wide exodus. And a lot of the sources say that, the people that the Urban League goes and interviews black Chicagoans shortly after the migration. And I get to the National Archives and I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, okay, are there any from Hattiesburg? And like half of them were from Hattiesburg. It was just astounding. And so they explain over and over again why they left. But it was for lack of a better term, this sort of chain, if you will. So people would write letters back to Hattiesburg. They would say, look, it's great, come on up. People would come down and visit. They would say, look, it's great, come on up. It was cheaper to go in groups. So you got a discount generally if you had a group of 10. Sometimes a group of 9 might go and just pay the extra ticket because it was cheaper overall. And so when you had sort of big groups of people going, I think it was easier for then the next group to go. There were people were talking about this in church. There were entire congregations. 2 congregations got up and left. and then paid for their pastors to then join them. So I think that was a big part of it. It was really part of the culture. I remember, I didn't cite this, but somebody said something to the effect of the people got Chicago in their minds just like they got religion or something like that. You know, and people walk around with the Chicago Defender. They're reading it all over Hattiesburg by this point in time. So it's a cultural exodus that obviously is, you know, motivated by Jim Crow, but it's just this wave. It's almost like, it almost is like a social movement, if you will.
Thank you all for being with us today. We've come to the top of another hour. If you have more questions, I'm sure William will be happy to answer those with you, maybe in line over here while you're looking at the books. Don't forget, Present Meets Past at the Old Capitol tomorrow night, and I hope we see you back here for History is Lunch with Will Jacks next week. Help me thank William Sturkey for this program today.
Thank you all so much.